I'm going to show how to use Sveltos to deploy Kyverno Helm chart in all my production clusters. I've created a kind cluster running locally on my laptop where Sveltos has been deployed, verify that Sveltos is up and running. And I also have created 3 different clusters, an EKS cluster, a GK cluster, and a Civo cluster. And I'm going to register those clusters to be managed by Sveltos. So first step is to register this cluster. So registering a cluster with Sveltos using the Sveltos kernel command, it's as simple as running this command here, where I'm telling like to register a cluster. In the namespace Civo, I'm naming this cluster, and Civo kubeconfig, it's the kubeconfig to access the Civo cluster. So I can repeat the same for my EKS cluster. I'm going to register the EKS cluster in the EKS namespace. And then for my GK cluster. So once all the cluster have been registered, I can verify that all clusters are healthy. I can verify this Sveltos cluster. And I can see that I have the Civo cluster, which is running version v1.29.2, the EKS cluster, which is running version v1.313, and the GK cluster, which is running version v1.36. The management cluster, has been automatically created by Sveltos upon deploying on my kind cluster, and essentially points to the kind cluster. This allows Sveltos to manage add-ons and application in my in the management cluster as well. The way Sveltos works is that when we deploy, I've prepared a configuration to deploy, create like a cluster profile. This is Sveltos configuration that is going to tell Sveltos to deploy the Kyverno charts in all clusters which have this label environment production. So in any cluster which has this label environment production, Sveltos is going to deploy this Kyverno Helm chart version 3.3.0 with those values. I can apply this configuration. It's been created. At this point, nothing happens because if we look at the clusters, double get Sveltos clusters in any namespace, and we look at their label. None of the clusters has the label environment production. So we can start adding this label, and we can start by adding the label to the GK cluster. So can do a kubectl label Sveltos cluster in the namespace GK, and we can label it with the label environment production. We can repeat the same operation for the EKS cluster. So now both my GK cluster and EKS cluster have this label environment production. Verify, once again, we get show labels. If we look at all the clusters and we look at the labels that every Sveltos cluster has, you can see that the EKS and the GK cluster both have the label environment production. Now, because both have the label environment production, we expect that the Sveltos is deploying the Kyverno Helm chart on those 2 clusters, and we can verify that. I'm going to use the Sveltos kernel add-on command, and I can see that Sveltos has detected that both the EKS cluster and the GK cluster are a match and has deployed Kyverno version 3.3.0. What if at this point I label my Civo cluster as well? So we can label the Sveltos cluster with the label environment production. As soon as we add this label to this GK, to this Civo cluster, Sveltos is going to detect that this cluster is also a match for the cluster profile, and it's going to deploy Kyverno Helm chart. And again, you can use the Sveltos kernel command, the show around, to verify that the Kyverno Helm chart has been deployed to the Civo cluster as well. Now, Sveltos is not limited to deploying Helm charts. Sveltos can deploy anything. And I have created a few config maps in my management cluster that contain Kyverno cluster policies. So we have several here. We have to disallow empty ingress, to disallow latest tag, and the external IPs. And each one of those contains a Kyverno cluster policy. If we look at this config map here, in the data section contains a Kyverno cluster policy. I have prepared like another cluster profile, and this cluster profile is called deploy Kyverno resources. It is again matching all clusters with label environment production. And what I'm telling in the policy ref section, I'm telling Sveltos is take those two config map, disallow latest tag into the default namespace, and disallow empty ingress into the default namespace. Take the content, and deploy to every cluster which has this label environment production. So we can apply this configuration. And as soon as we apply this configuration, what Sveltos now does, it knows that there are three clusters, Civo, GKE, and EKS, which are all a match for this cluster profile, and it's going to deploy the content, those cluster, Kyverno cluster policies in those clusters. Can verify that this configuration has been deployed. Again, we will use the show add-ons command. And when we use the show add-on commands, we can see that the cluster policies, disallow latest tag, and disallow empty ingress host has been deployed to the Civo cluster. And the same Kyverno cluster policy is being deployed to the EKS cluster and GK cluster. We can demo one last thing. We can go back to the Kyverno resources, and we can add yet another, we can change this configuration, and we can tell Sveltos to deploy the content of the config map. This is called external IPs, which is a config map present in the management cluster, which contains yet another Kyverno cluster policy. So I'm going to apply this configuration, which is simply modifying the cluster policy, which we already had. And we used to have like, so if we check now the Sveltos travel command, it show add-ons, we can see now that three cluster policies are deployed in every production cluster. So this is for the Civo, this is for the EKS cluster, and this is for the GK cluster. So this is how simple it is to deploy Helm chart or Kubernetes resources using like YAML or JSON in every cluster which is matching a specific labels. What happens if we remove the label from one of those clusters, and one of those clusters is not a match anymore? We can, for instance, do a kubectl edit of the Sveltos cluster in the EKS namespace, and we can remove the label environment production. Now, because we remove like this label, so we can verify that the label has been removed. We can see now that the label environment production is only present on the Civo cluster and only on the GK cluster. Because the EKS cluster is not a match anymore, what Sveltos is going to do is going to withdraw all the policies that Sveltos had deployed. So in this case, the Kyverno chart and the three Kyverno cluster policies. This is Sveltos default behavior, which can be changed because there are different use cases where we don't want this behavior, but this is the default behavior. By default, Sveltos is going to remove whatever deployed when a cluster stops being a match. And we can verify that the withdrawn is happening. So if we look at the showdowns, we can see that when we go to the EKS cluster, the Kyverno cluster policies have already been removed, and the Helm chart, the Kyverno Helm chart is being withdrawn. So we can wait a few more seconds for the Helm chart to be removed. And now we can see essentially that everything is being withdrawn from the EKS cluster because that cluster is not a match anymore. Sveltos also comes with dashboard. So I'm gonna show the dashboard here. Going to the dashboard, we can use we can see all the clusters. And if we go to any of those clusters here, we can see what's being deployed on this cluster. For instance, if I select the GK cluster, I can see that the Kyverno chart has been deployed, and this is the time where it was deployed on this cluster. And this is the cluster profile that caused this Kyverno and chart to be deployed. If I go to the resources, I can see there are 3 cluster policies, and this is the time when those resources were deployed. This is the cluster profile that are a match for this cluster here. And this is the state of when those, this is the state. We know that everything was successfully deployed. So this is all. Hope you enjoy like this short video. Thank you.